welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. I say welcome back, you may have only just discovered my channel today, in which case, hi, I release crime content, deep dive crime content, twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays. So if you like crime and you like consistency, this is definitely the channel for you. Also, thanks to everybody who comes back regularly. I love your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, you help me loads. Same to my Patreon subs, thank you. I've also got Contribee now as well, where people can subscribe there to listen to lots of exclusive content. But just to recognise all of you, you lovely people who support me making these videos. It makes a massive difference to my life and I love doing it so much. Today's case is one that I spent the entire case with my blood boiling. And again, it's one that you asked me to cover. It's very, very challenging, I'm not gonna lie, but at the same time, it's really present for me right now because what we saw in the early lockdown was that domestic homicide basically doubled. So when you lock people up with their abusers, or you cause extra stresses in abusive relationships, or even ex-abusive relationships where relationships have broken down, the pressure that is increased in those circumstances can lead to really catastrophic outcomes. So I wanted to cover this case for lots of reasons. One of the main ones being that it's just unbelievable that in this day and age, we are still losing men and women to domestic homicide. And even more troubling for most of us, we are losing children to it. So I'm going to be covering the case of Daniel Boulton. Daniel Boulton murdered his ex-partner Bethany Vincent. And even more disturbing, he also murdered her son, DJ. That's the case that we're going to look at today. We're going to explore the experiences that Bethany had, and we're also going to look at exactly what played out in that crime. 26-year-old Bethany Vincent, she lived on High Holme Road in a small market town of Louth, Lincolnshire. I don't know whether you know Lincolnshire, it's a very beautiful area, lots of countryside, and a place that hopefully bringing up children would be a lovely experience to do in that area. She was incredibly caring, a very loving, very family-orientated person. She was known by people who were friends and, of course, more importantly, her family, to be an individual who would always put her children before anything else. They were her priority. And she was a young woman. She was 26 at the time of her death. She had the whole of her life ahead of her. And right now, that's exactly what that woman should be doing. She should be living her life freely and happily with her much beloved children. Just to acknowledge that. You know, I am one of those people who will come down hard on parents who abuse their children or who prioritize partners as well, because let's be honest, there are situations and cases that I have covered where a parent has gone out of their way to select and choose a partner instead of thinking about the impact that's having on their child. It wasn't the case for Bethany. Bethany Vincent put her children above everyone else. She was devoted to DJ, absolutely devoted. Bethany lived with her 9-year-old son, Darren Henson. Darren was actually known as a DJ, so all his family referred to him as DJ. And this was a child that Bethany had had with a previous partner, Darren Henson. Their relationship had broken down. This is when DJ was just a toddler, so very similar to my own marriage. These things happen. And obviously you do your best to be co-parents. And Bethany and Kieran did a really good job because DJ saw his dad very regularly, and also to note that his father was known as an excellent father. So as a couple who had experienced dysfunction, i.e. the breakdown of their relationship, when it came down to their child, they were devoted to him. And that's really important to note. DJ was a really happy little boy. He was an avid Chelsea fan, so he adored his football. Incredibly well loved by his family, both immediate and the wider. He also had autism, and this included, within his presentation of symptoms, some signs of delayed development. So obviously there were some additional needs because he wasn't typical in his experience of the world. There was neurodiversity there. But nonetheless, it didn't interfere with his experience within the family. He was just adored. Now, Bethany, single mother, been with her child for a period of time since he was a toddler growing up, prioritizing that child, still going to have needs. So she eventually starts a relationship with 30-year-old Daniel Bolton. This is only back in 2019. Bear in mind, we are just in 2022, and I am talking about the murder of Bethany and her child. And yet we are talking about her meeting this man in 2019. He was unemployed at the time. He'd been a former amusement arcade worker, and they had met how a lot of people meet these days on the Tinder dating app. Initially, the reports about their relationship was that they were happy, that it was a good relationship, that she was happy to have met somebody, and that there didn't seem initially to be any real red flags. He would often stay at her home, as you would imagine. Particularly when you have children, it's actually really difficult when you start a new relationship, because there is the balance about wanting to protect your child and wanting to also create an opportunity for that child to meet the partner at some point, so that hopefully you can become a family unit to some sort. And at the same time, knowing when to do that is quite challenging, isn't it? And you don't get to go out very often when you're a single parent. Even if you've got support around you, very few of us feel that comfortable asking constantly to get babysitting. So I think it's really important to note that a lot of times that means that relatively early on in relationships, the new partner may come to the home because it's the only space that you have to share together without asking for support outside, so that you can leave the house and go elsewhere. So he would stay there, and even though the reports are kind of patchy on this, it does seem that they did have a child together. So there was a little boy born around August 2020. We don't know exactly when that was, but that seems to be what I've drawn out of the information, about August 2020. But this can often, with respect, when a new child becomes part of a relationship, it can almost be a trigger for certain types of behaviour, because when you have a child with somebody, there can be this territorial aspect to it. So he's looking at this relationship now and considering the fact that they have a child together as a position of him having a very clear foot in the door regarding Bethany's wider life. They are now a family, right? So often this can be something, one, that causes stress, new children do, but two, it can mean that you feel that you have more of a level of importance in your partner's life because you have a child together. And if you have a temperament, shall we say, where you like to believe that you are a powerful individual, you like to feel that you have a domination and a control over a relationship, then a child will give you a new aspect to that, so to speak. It doesn't seem that it took that long for Bolton's true character to start being revealed. And people described him as being really nice in one moment and then a monster in the next. So that classic Jekyll and Hyde personality. And he did become very violent towards Bethany and DJ. And we can tell this because of the story that I'm telling. I'm obviously talking about the horrible murders of both innocent people. And it seems that by March 2019, so relatively early on when they met, the relationship had started to deteriorate. Now, just to put it out there, one of the things that a lot of people struggle with when there's domestic abuse is why people stay. Now, there are lots of different reasons why people stay in domestically abusive scenarios. So for one, people can be really scared. You know, you can be terrified of a partner, and you can imagine that there will be consequences that are really terrible for you if you desire leaving, and if you assert yourself and leave that way, that the consequences may be catastrophic for you. That's number one. But there can also be reasons such as, if we meet somebody and they seem to be an answer to our prayers and they're wonderful with us and they make us feel amazing in those early months, and then something changes, it's so blindsiding. It really is. You're like, wait a minute, this person was the most amazing human being around me. I felt loved and he's been devoted to me and surely our relationship was going somewhere special, and maybe he's just having a bad time, and maybe I just need to change my behaviour, and maybe it's all going to go back to how it was in that honeymoon period. And that can keep people going in really toxic relationships for a long period of time. Now, it turns out that Bolton did have some pretty long-standing and complex mental health issues, and he'd been involved with various mental health support services, and that was dating all the way back to 2004. His behaviour had been problematic from a young age. So from the age of 13, he was binge drinking really large amounts of alcohol, and he gambled money up to £1,000 at a time. He'd never managed to hold down a long-term job, and when she met him, he was actually living in Witham Lodge Hostel that was run by the Salvation Army. He'd actually moved into that place after leaving his parents' home the year before. And I think we can all deduce that there wasn't a lot of foundation and security in his life. None of that excuses his subsequent behaviour, but just to analyse what made him, what created him, what his foundations were. And when you look at his background, it isn't just enough to say, okay, well, there were problems systemically within his life and his social and familiar experience. Actually, his mental health wasn't the only concern, because this was a guy who had quite a propensity for violence. He was a relatively dangerous man. And this is, when you look at his background, evidence in the kind of convictions that he had. So he had a chain of previous convictions. He'd assaulted 5 different police officers. Now, that's important to note. Obviously, police officers are there to serve and protect. We know that. But they also symbolise something quite powerful in our society. It's as if you were in a situation in a supermarket, say, and you get into an argument with a random customer who is, as far as you're concerned, equal to you. And you have a good old Barney, and you're not really that concerned about the consequences, because after all, they're just another normal human being. Change that person to a police officer. You are less likely, as a law-abiding citizen, to get into a confrontation with a police officer, because you feel that they have the full weight and force of the land of the law on their shoulders, so to speak. So you're probably not going to swear at them. You're probably not going to get into a situation where you're insulting, because you don't want the consequences, because you have clear boundaries. When you are somebody who has literally assaulted 5 different police officers, we see really poor boundaries and also very poor levels of impulse control. So that makes you more dangerous than the average person, because you don't abide by those standards that are expected. And when you don't abide by standards that are expected, your behaviour can absolutely fall outside those expectations, meaning that you are more willing to do things that can get you into trouble, but that can also harm other people. Also, he committed an armed robbery with a knife. He had 5 violent offences, and 3 of these actually involved assaults against women that he'd been in relationships with. So we have a history of domestic violence. 1 was committed against a previous girlfriend, and 2 offences would actually be committed against Bethany. That was in November and December 2020. So we have a history of very problematic behaviour and violent behaviour. And what we also have on a personality level is a very manipulative and controlling individual. Bolton certainly fits that understanding and explanation. He's definitely manipulative and very controlling. And this is something that starts to play out in the way he approaches Bethany. So he wants to control literally every aspect of her life and her thinking. And any of you who've been coercively controlled or domestically abused, you will know that that is something that perpetrators do. They try to make it so that they are in charge of every movement. And part of that is to do with their deep insecurity that there is a potential that they will lose you, and therefore the more that they can tighten the screws, the less they feel that you'll feel able to leave. And also because they get a lot of a payoff. They get paid off. There is a positive experience for them that reinforces that behaviour, because they get to know everything that you're doing and they start thinking for you to some degree, and they love that. It feeds into that desire to dominate. Also, he subjects her to physical violence, And this is another way of controlling her, because if you can scare somebody, then this means that logistically you will be able to dominate them. And he was also really psychologically abusive. So he's constantly criticizing her, constantly patronizing her, and constantly putting her down. We know that perpetrators' toolkits have this particular zone where it's all about degrading the partner to make them feel that no one else will want them. Because if we can isolate them, shame them, make them feel less than, then their self-esteem will be so fractured, so impacted on, that they won't leave potentially, because they'll genuinely believe they're a worthless human being who deserves what's happening to them. That's the toolkit of a domestic perpetrator. And he definitely wanted to isolate her as well. Remember, she came from a loving, supportive family. And that's a problem for him. When you have a loving, supportive family, well, they're going to notice when your behaviour changes. They're going to step in if somebody's harming you. They're going to protect you at all costs. And so if they have a gaze onto the situation, well, they can do something about that. So he needs to try to keep her family away from her so that he has more access and he can dominate her accordingly. So he's making her life very, very difficult, wanting to stop her seeing her family. And he starts having these bizarre conversations as far as I'm concerned, because he actually starts saying that she has to give up DJ. Yeah. He suggests that she has to give up her son. I mean, when you think about power play and also the arrogance level that has to come from a human being who believes a loving mother would choose to give up her own child because the boyfriend says that that should happen, that shows his complete mismatch with reality. This guy's perception is not based in reality. And he also does things like limiting Bethany's access to the internet. One, you could say he doesn't want her to get in contact with other guys. That's his fear. But another is he doesn't want her seeking support. The internet has got a lot of avenues that you can go down to kind of inform yourself about what's happening in your world. And if you get educated that this isn't acceptable, this relationship is bad, because you're kind of seeing information on, shall we say, coercive control or forums where women are talking about this kind of issue, that could equip her. So he doesn't want her to have access to any of that. And the actual abuse got so bad that it started to do its trick to some degree, and Bethany starts to get really depressed to the point where she actually seeks medical treatment. So you can tell that it's got to a very desperate level for Bethany when she is feeling so trapped that she needs to go and seek help from her GP. Now, as I've just mentioned, Bolton had created this really intense hatred of DJ, this like innocent child who's done literally nothing wrong. The only thing that DJ has done is exist. And that's enough for Bolton to start creating this real, I would say, jealousy and rage in equal measure. So first of all, definitely saw that DJ was a threat to his relationship with Bethany. And damn straight it would be, because Bethany unconditionally loves her son. And Bethany will definitely choose her son and her son's safety over her relationship with Bolton. So Bolton is correct in his assumption that she will definitely promote and prioritize her child over him, and he doesn't like that. It's bizarre when we actually start to think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a grown man who would be jealous of a little boy who was managing to have some of his mother's attention. That's what we're talking about, really. And it's ironic as well, because I think the mark of an adult parent is how they treat their child. And if they treat their child better than their partner, I think they're in the right place. Children require us to be their biggest cheerleader. They require us to make them feel safer than anybody else makes them feel. They require us to choose them because they don't have a lot of choices. So we have to make sure that they always feel that there is a sure thing in their life. I give my example with my own relationship. My husband always knows that there is no comparison, not because I don't love him, but because I had my boys. They're my boys. And so I want them to always know that they were my choice. Not everybody might agree with that, but it's the way that I brought my children up, and that's why they're so secure, because they know that I am their safe place. And this is what Bethany was doing. She let DJ know that she was her safe place, but he cannot stand that. And like I said, most of us would see that as an endearing quality. Well, this woman is such a good mother that of course she prioritises her child, and that would make her a great caregiver to new children, a great mother to new children. So these are all positives, but not for him. Bolton hates it. Also, he's got this utterly reprehensible stroke bizarre issue with DJ's autism. So he irrationally believes that somehow, because DJ is autistic, that condition would be contagious and affect his own son. So Bolton is just making up these ridiculous assumptions and then using that to vent on the child. Anybody who has an ounce of intelligence knows that autism is not contagious, but also let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's believe that Bolton missed the class on common sense and instead was considering the fact that potentially autism was contagious. Well, you'd just do a bit of a Google search, wouldn't you, to realise that you were the one making up ridiculous issues and ideas in your head. But Bolton didn't get the memo on Google, could join Tinder, knew how to stop people using the internet, but couldn't use it himself. Like I said, this is somebody who's clutching at straws and just trying to make DJ a perpetrator of pain in his life, as opposed to dealing with the reality of the fact that this is a little boy who is autistic and has done nothing wrong at all. But like I said, he's got this convinced mindset that the autism's going to rub off on his new child. Bolton would also refer to DJ in the most reprehensible of ways. He would use words, and these are his words. I would not say these words unless I was showing you the information that denotes what kind of human being Bolton is. He would refer to DJ, this gorgeous little boy, gorgeous, as a retard and a little bastard. Oh, that kind of language is both bullying and completely unintelligent, isn't it? Because it's clear that he's calling him names because it's a position of pain for people who love him to hear, but also it's just the callousness of those particular names. I mean, this child is autistic, and to label them with such an old-fashioned word that is considered completely and unequivocally inappropriate to use these days, again, demonstrates the level of hate that he's building towards this child. He even at one point suggested that DJ wasn't actually autistic, and instead he was just really naughty and he needed discipline. Again, this idea that a child is choosing their behaviour and not acknowledging and accepting that children are innocent victims in a world around them, and when they have extra needs, the world becomes even more complex and confusing, and the one thing that they need is time and understanding and patience, and instead he just believes that this child is choosing his behaviour. And he actually made threats to Bethany and to actually several other people that he wanted DJ dead, which is mind-blowing. And the reason he believed that is because if DJ was out of the way, he would have his own way, essentially. And what we know about Bolton, and certainly from the research that I've done, if there is one thing that's very clear throughout his life, it's when Bolton doesn't get his own way, he gets very, very frustrated. And when he gets very frustrated, he gets very violent. Think about this as well. DJ knows that Bolton doesn't like him. I mean, how horrific would that be for that child? That this man, this bully, this individual who goes out of his way to poke fun at this child with needs actually understands that he isn't liked by him. DJ must have wondered what he'd done wrong, and I'm sure Bethany was reassuring him, He hadn't done anything wrong, but it must have been awfully painful for him. What I will say though is that DJ had this great family network who was so loving, and they did try their best to protect him from Bolton's horrific threats and horrible threats. So they were really trying. Bethany's parents, Caroline and Darren, they had actually been concerned about their daughter's relationship with Bolton for quite a long time, but not initially. Because initially, like most of us, they had a confirmation bias in the fact that they sought to approve of their daughter's choices. And that's what we do. When we're introduced to people that may have meaning in our life, particularly through a conduit like a daughter or a son, we absolutely want to like them. We want to get on with them because we're thinking, if this person's going to have a future with my child, I want to like them. And that can do a great deal to make us look for the best parts in that person and to deny the little bits and streaks that we might see that aren't that great. And so initially that's what they do. They confirm that their daughter's making a good choice and this guy seems okay, but it's not long. So initially they think he's a nice, smart lad, but not long after, a few months in, they see that he's highly controlling, incredibly aggressive. And they also felt that recognition that he was trying to create distance between them and Bethany. So he's trying to reduce the contact that they have with one another. And she actually does become relatively distant. She didn't go and see them as often. And one of the reasons for this is that Bolton is literally by her side most of the time. So she doesn't get any space. And he obviously doesn't want to go to her parents' house. He's controlling that relationship. So that's making it more and more difficult for her to have any relationship with her parents, who, remember, are incredibly loving, both to her and to her son, DJ. Another thing that's really problematic is that Bethany gives up her job. Now, for her to do that, we can imagine there was some duress, that she was basically being bullied into doing that by Bolton. And again, why is he doing that? Well, when you go to work, you have support, you have colleagues. Hey, you might meet somebody who's better than the scumbag you're hanging out with. But it also demonstrates that there is this wanting to appease him. So she's going ahead and changing her life to accommodate his needs. So what can we say about Bethany? Well, we can say that Bethany is highly agreeable. It's a personality trait that is often noted in women. It means that we sacrifice our own needs as well at times to accommodate others. It can make it great for people around you when you're agreeable because you're agreeable, but it's not that great when you're trying to get ahead in the workplace or you're trying to deal with a partner who is nasty, because it's in your nature to try to accommodate their needs. Also, he didn't keep the violence distant from people that she knew. So what we'd expect to see in a lot of perpetrators is that they're horribly violent and aggressive and bullying when they're with their partner behind closed doors, but they're not necessarily overt in front of people who know them, because that gives that person from outside their relationship insight into the toxicity, and also, of course, can mean that they themselves are now a witness to the kind of behaviour that's playing out. But on one occasion, Caroline, so her own mother, was actually present when Bolton threw Bethany onto a couch. So he's really not concerned with barriers and boundaries. He's not concerned with reputation. He's more impulsive around his own needs. So Bethany did something he didn't like. Doesn't matter that her mum's present, he's going to throw her onto that couch. And then he actually confronts Caroline nose to nose. And you can imagine what Caroline would be doing in this circumstance. She's just watched her daughter be thrown onto a couch. Damn right she's going to be confronting him. Damn right she's not going to be backing down, because she's Mama Bear. And she's going to be letting him know, I don't agree with this behaviour, and you better check the way that you act in front of me and my daughter. And she said that as a human being, he was just really nasty, angry, and loud. And we can all see that from the little bit that I've described. I mean, it's highly toxic when somebody is willing to be overtly violent in front of somebody who is a primary caregiver. November 2020, there's an argument, and it's over DJ. And Bolton violently attacks Bethany. He bangs her head against a wall, and then he punches her multiple times. She is so distraught by this. She is so aware that this is completely outside the realms of acceptable that she actually walks to the police station to report this. Now, he's following her. Again, he's trying to manipulate her. He's emotionally abusing her, telling her about how miserable his life was and how he wanted to end his life. So just like pulling those emotional heartstrings to try to get her to change her mind, to say, you know, my needs are more important than yours. You're going to go and talk to the police, and that's going to mean that I want to further end my life, so you're now contributing to my demise. That kind of constant abuse that she would be facing is all about his needs. And the one thing that we know about truly suicidal people is it's never about their needs. Like, somebody kills themselves not because they have needs of other people. They kill themselves because they are living in their own misery and they feel that the world would be better off without them. It's totally misguided and totally wrong, but they are the least likely to ask for the needs that they want to be met. And yet here he is, using her as an emotional radiator to just drag out the very last bits of life, as far as he's concerned, that she requires to look after herself, and instead to project all of her care and attention onto him. Ultimately, it seems that at this point, the continual physical, mental and emotional abuse has just got too much for her. You know, she's coped with so much. So she says to the police she wants him out of her life for good, and rightfully so. This poor woman has been to hell and back. So after around 2 years, she's put up with this, 2 years of abuse at Bolton's hands, Bethany goes to court and she obtains a restraining order against him. And he's told that he has to stay away from her and DJ. Damn right. He's horribly dangerous. Also, they ban him from contacting her. And her mum actually said that it's at this point that she felt like she was getting her daughter back. She's more like her old self, and obviously she had her sights on a future without Bolton, without being bullied, an opportunity to heal the wounds that have been inflicted by that bully. However, even though we've got a restraining order, which means that legally Bolton should not have contact with her, he doesn't care at all. He's got this restraining order placed on him, couldn't care less. Remember, boundaries do not apply to this kind of psyche, this kind of personality. He is still absolutely determined to control her. He wants to control Bethany. He wants to get his own way. And he is continually breaching the conditions of the order. He continues to harass her. And it gets so bad that even social services get involved, because they are looking at Bolton and they can see that he poses a very high risk to Bethany and to her family. So they are getting involved and they are acknowledging this man has serious form, and we think there could be some real catastrophes involved with this case unless it is looked after in a way that means that Bethany is protected. Bear that in mind, because obviously what we're talking about is failures to protect, aren't we? February 2021, he is just continually breaching the restraining order. And he constantly avoids the reality of what this means by just texting her and calling her and harassing her and getting in contact with her through other means like taking out fake Facebook profiles. And so he's constantly breaching it. So in spite of the fact that he's not going to go anywhere near her, he ends up physically assaulting her again. So not only is he contacting Bethany by phone and so on and so forth, he is just flagrantly flaunting the rules because he's actually physically assaulted her. And in a police statement, Bethany said, "Nobody has the right to hurt me like this. I don't want him anywhere near me and my family. I am willing to attend court as I really want him out of my life." So at this point, Bolton is prosecuted and a further restraining order is issued by the court against him. It's irrelevant. He doesn't care. The harassment just carries on. And he's still contacting her by text, by phone, by social media. Also, he physically shows up unannounced and uninvited to her home. Totally fixated on Bethany. Totally fixated on her and the relationship that she has with DJ. And to add to an even more problematic situation, if you can imagine it, is that he starts taking cocaine around this time. Now think about that. Cocaine undoubtedly can provoke more aggressive responses in people who take it. Add to the ingredients list of possibility and potential. This guy is already highly violent. This guy has poor boundaries. This guy is somebody who we know doesn't listen to authority, and now he's under the influence of cocaine. This is obviously going to aggravate his behaviour even further. And it's getting so bad, as far as Bethany is concerned, that she's really in fear of her life. So she thinks that there is a strong possibility that Bolton is going to come for her and for her family. And she decides that the only way that she's going to be able to counter this is to move away to a secret location. This is somewhere that Bolton's not going to be able to get her. I mean, to be that scared that you think, I'm going to leave all of my familiar surroundings, I'm going to go away from the place that I know best, and I'm going to move somewhere this person doesn't know, that's not because you are overreacting. That comes from a place of absolute fear. This poor woman knows that he has the potential to cause her serious harm. He's already seriously harmed her as far as being very violent. He's already threatened the life of her child. He doesn't listen to any authority whatsoever. So now she's thinking the only way to protect herself is to go to a secret location. Sadly, by May 2021, he's actually learned about this happening. So he's realised that she is planning to escape him. Now, this really bothers me. It really bothers me because clearly she hasn't told him that she wants to move. So who did? Who had loose lips and let this violent perpetrator become aware of this intention that she had to protect herself and her family? Sometimes we have to be really careful about what we say and what we speak, because these ramifications of circumstances like this don't need to play out how this played out. And whoever decided to take that confidential information and spread it, well, we're talking about the consequences of that right now. Now, if she moves, remember what that's going to do to him. This is a man who dominates, who bullies, who controls. He's clearly fixated in a really toxic way on Bethany. And now he realizes that she is leaving him, as in she is taking the power back, and he will have absolutely no way of controlling her movements, her future, her experiences, the way that she chooses to live. It will all be beyond him because she has asserted herself and her right to live freely and safely. But the knowledge that she's going to be beyond his control is just a red rag to a bull. And he knows there's absolutely no way he's going to let this happen. Now, initially, he tries the really self-indulgent method, trying to get his own way. So from the 25th of May 2021, he basically bombards Bethany with messages, so many of them, sent nearly 900 messages over the course of a single weekend. That was using a fake Facebook account. Like lots and lots of abusive partners, he just does the classic, I'm the victim, it's all about me. You know, you're being so nasty, wanting to leave me. I'm the poor person. Yes, I've been very violent to you. Yes, I've threatened the death of your child. Yes, I've been abusive in front of your own parent. But you know, at the end of the day, it's because you don't know how to treat me that I'm so sad. That kind of victim mentality dressed really in the most aggressive perpetrator's clothing you could imagine, isn't it? But trying to play this internal victim. And he professes his love for her, also expresses the love he has for his own son, threatens to take his own life, because again, that's the ultimate, isn't it? If you do this and I kill myself, then you are basically my murderer. You know, it's a very manipulative way. And we see people doing this and playing this line all the time. And he says, you destroyed my life and have the cheek to say, I ruined yours. Can you see how he's trying to turn that around? You destroyed my life and have the cheek to say I ruined yours. Well, Bethany didn't raise a hand to you. All she did was react to the fact that she got beaten really badly by you and told the police that she wanted you away from her. How did she cause you to do that? You did that, it's on you. But you can see that cycle of believing that somehow, in spite of his actions, he's just the innocent passenger in this awful train wreck that she's caused. Bethany is amazing. She doesn't respond to any single one of those messages. And that's really important, because what happens in domestic abuse cases often is a partner will be in a scenario, or an ex-partner will be in a scenario where the ex or the partner is texting them constantly. And of course, because of the restraining order, there is a legal obligation on both sides, you as the perpetrator not to contact the victim, and the victim not to contact you, because otherwise it suggests that the relationship has a level of connection that isn't meant to be there, hence why the restraining order exists. Bethany does not respond to him at all. She is out of this relationship. She has made the difficult decision, and she is working that plan. Now, after this fails and he doesn't get his own way, he decides instead he's going to take that customary direct approach that we've talked about, that more physically aggressive and scary approach that he hasn't just used with her, he's used with previous partners, he's used with the police. We see his makeup. He's very good at using his physical dominance to get what he wants. So just before midnight on the 30th of May 2021, Bolton is determined, he really is. So he starts walking from Witham Lodge homeless shelter in Skegness, and he walks up the coast of Mablethorpe and then west to Bethany's home in Louth. He's carrying a blue rope with him, and earlier that day at 4 p.m, he had texted her saying, "Nightmare on Holmes Street." I mean, could that be any more ominous? Nightmare on Holmes Street. And it feels like this was him stating the reality that was going to play out. He was going to make that experience a nightmare on that street for Bethany. And I suppose for anybody who lived near Bethany, that it becomes a nightmare what plays out. So on the 31st of May 2021, this is just a few days before Bethany, DJ and her baby were due to move to a new secret location. So bear that in mind. She has freedom just in front of her, new life, new opportunity, safety, and it's right there. But late morning that day, Bolton's walked all the way to Louth, and they have CCTV showing him mentoring the co-op opposite Bethany's home. And Bolton then arrives on Bethany's doorstep. It's around midday. He's true to form, he's shouting, he's being really abusive, just as usual. He's demanding to be let in. Now, the neighbours are used to this. They've seen him do this regularly. They don't pay him a lot of attention. His presence has been at the property before. They're used to this rowdy behaviour. And whilst it's not completely clear, it's believed that he produces the rope that he's carrying to kind of psychologically abuse Bethany. Remember, he's threatened to take his own life if she doesn't take him back. So he's trying to manipulate her, he's trying to control her with this idea of guilt, and is claiming that it's going to be her fault if their son grows up without a father because, you know, she's the reason he's killed himself. And I have to say, yet again, Bethany is faultless in this situation. She refuses to let him in. She refuses to let him see his son, because she knows, one, he's in a mood where violence could ensue, two, there is a restraining order, and most of all, this guy has turned up uninvited in spite of a restraining order, and he is threatening to harm himself. Well, if you're threatening to harm yourself and you have a propensity for violence, that could easily mean that shortly you'll be threatening to harm me. This goes on, by the way, so it's the evening now of the 31st of May 2021, and DJ has been with his dad, Darren Henson. So Bethany's obviously going to let him in, and before going to bed, he and Bethany end up FaceTiming with his gran, Darren Vincent. So just after 8 p.m, DJ gets tucked up by his mummy safely in bed. However, in spite of the fact that everything seems quite peaceful, and even though earlier in the day we have seen Bolton disturbing their peaceful experience, at this moment in time it feels quiet. They're not expecting to be disturbed. How wrong they were. Because Bolton returns to their home. He'd basically been loitering, wasting time in Louth. He'd been waiting for Bethany to collect DJ from his dad's. That's what he had been waiting for, to make sure that they were together. Because his plan wasn't just about harming Bethany. When he turns up, the neighbours, again, with respect, aren't that concerned. They're not that suspicious. You know, they understand that he's been there regularly. He hasn't done anything so catastrophic as what's going to play out. So even though they recognise that he's probably this loud-mouthed thug, they aren't imagining that he's about to murder 2 innocent people. I mean, had they known what was on his mind that evening, I'm sure they would have thought differently. And he just kicks in the front door, just goes straight into Bethany's home. And I don't know whether any of us can imagine that. You know, we have our front doors, don't we? And we have those front doors as a barrier between the outside world and our internal safety. And for some bizarre reason, we trust that those front doors will protect us. Certainly I do. Can you imagine the horror that you feel when somebody kicks in your front door? Ironically, I had this happen to me. I was living in Australia, in Sydney, in King's Cross, and there was a guy who had schizophrenia downstairs, and I didn't know this, but he kept coming to my home and asking whether Lorraine was in, and I kept saying, no, Lorraine isn't there. I could kind of see there was something wrong with him, but I didn't know what was happening. And then one evening he came up, and by this time I was kind of a bit annoyed because he'd been doing this every single evening. I was just about to sit down to a sandwich, and I said, look, can you stop coming up? There's nobody in here. I sat down, and then within about 2 minutes, the door was just off its frame. I mean, it splintered everywhere, and he came in because he was convinced I had a brain-sucking machine in my home. But I can still remember that feeling of just extraordinary shock because that was my front door. And now it was just on the floor in front of me. And for Bethany, imagine the terror. This is somebody kicking her door in that she knows has a propensity and indeed has actioned violence on her many times. So shortly after 8:19 p.m, just to say, 2 young girls, they were 9 and 12, they're basically on the way to the local park, and they hear cries. And they hear cries coming from the open window of the house, and it's Bethany. She's frantically shouting for somebody to call the police. They see her at the window and they actually go over to see if they could help. These are kids 9 and 12, and they're running into the face of danger. Meanwhile, adults on the path, they just walk past. Now, I know that a lot of you will be aware of Kitty Genevieve's bystander interaction intervention, which is that often when there's more people walking past a door or past a scene of a crime, they just kind of carry on because they think somebody else will sort it out. Whereas if there's only one person, they're more likely to take responsibility for it. It blows my mind that we're still having this conversation, right? If you hear somebody crying out for help, help. It is as simple as that. Now, it's worth noting that there's 2 amazingly brave young girls would later be awarded £500 each by the court because they tried to help Bethany. They tried to help Bethany when nobody else tried. They saw that Bethany was clearly in need of help and they dialed 999. However, a man appeared at the window at that point and he was holding a blue rope. We know who that is. And clearly the kids are really scared by this. They run away. But nonetheless, what incredible kids to have done that when everybody else walked by. They didn't. Unbelievable. And it's not long after that Bolton leaves Bethany's house. He looks flushed and agitated, according to witnesses, and he actually tells the passerby someone's been stabbed and tells them to call the ambulance. Then he calmly walks away before the actual ambulance arrives and he just smokes his cigarette, right? So hardly looking like somebody who's in distress. Hardly what you would expect from somebody who had just killed his ex-partner and her defenceless, innocent child. Now, I cannot say how each individual paramedic and police officer felt when they arrived, but I have heard a police officer who was high up in the investigation telling the press that for him, even though every single murder is tragic and deeply disturbing, it was the most emotive thing that he ever witnessed. So it was the most challenging for him to witness this horrific scene because they're greeted with absolute carnage. First of all, they find the battered body of Bethany. She's covered in blood. She's in the front room. She'd been stabbed. She'd been beaten. Her injuries, as far as the stabbings were concerned, she'd been stabbed 9 times. And crawling on the floor alone, just near her body, was her and Bolton's 9-month-old baby son. He murdered that poor woman in front of their child. Now, he was unharmed, but he was very distressed. And this would have been tragedy beyond measure for anybody who is turning up and witnessing this scene. But then they go upstairs and they're greeted by a vision of an innocent 9-year-old boy. DJ is on his bedroom floor. He was wearing his favourite Chelsea shirt. He had been stabbed at least 12 times. 12 times. Think about it. A 9-year-old child. That's a massacre. The police instantly launch a massive police hunt. Of course they do. The manhunt is on. They're looking for Bolton. They're going to bring him to justice. There is no doubt about that. They want him alive too. They want that man to face justice. The autopsies on those two victims, poor Bethany and DJ, well, they established that each of the victims, as I've said, was stabbed multiple times in multiple places. Bethany had wounds that looked like she'd defended herself. And the judge would later say that as far as the attack on DJ was concerned, it was particularly ferocious. It's like Bolton's irrational hatred of that poor child was evident in these horrific injuries that he inflicted. Poor DJ suffered stab wounds to his skull, to his face, to his neck, to his chest, to his back, and to his legs. And the deepest stab to both victims, so the deepest stab to both victims, bear in mind, this is a man who knew what he was doing, because the deepest stab to both Bethany and poor DJ was through the costal cartilage of the third rib. That's through the pericardium and right through the heart. Bolton did not intend to leave witnesses. He didn't intend to injure those two individuals. He wanted to execute them, and he knew how. He knew exactly where and how to inflict the deepest and most fatal wounds. As we know, Bolton is now on the run. Now, one could argue, if we're going to listen to what he said prior to this, that he's now had ample time to kill himself. Bear in mind, he can't live without Bethany. Bear in mind, he's been emotionally blackmailing her with this idea that he just can't go on without her. Well, doesn't seem like he's gone ahead with that plan. No, he's on the run. And he seems to be intending to run away as quickly and as far as possible. So later that night, obviously, he needs to get his head together. He's not quite figured out what he's going to do next. So he breaks into an empty bungalow and he stays there overnight. He steals some food, he steals some alcohol. He also takes a change of clothing. Bizarrely also admits full responsibility for Bethany and DJ's deaths. This is what he writes. I, Daniel Bolton, take full responsibility for 182. 182 is the number of Bethany's house. So he's letting them know he was the person who's done this. And we can all decide on what we think about that. Is it that he's intending to say that because he's about to go and kill himself? I don't buy into that. I think what he was doing was trying to seem like he had some remorse. You see, if you have an ounce of intelligence as a criminal, and believe me, many criminals don't seem to have that. Let's be honest, prisons are full of really bad criminals. They don't get away with it. They're not bright enough to get away with it. But nonetheless, as far as he's concerned, it's probably an opportunity for him to show this remorse level, because you know, in court, if you're more likely to show remorse, if you're likely to take culpability for what you've done, there can be more of a plea deal scenario, right? Although one could argue he's just written a full admission. So why would they need to? I mean, if you've just admitted that you're guilty, which he clearly has, that arguably could be very, very useful for the prosecution. We'll talk about that later on, shall we? So the following day, he's still on the run, and actually, unbelievable, he's spotted by an off-duty police officer, PC Stephen Dennis. PC Stephen Dennis is basically walking his dogs, Cooper, the border collie, and Zorro, the Sprocker puppy. I think it's important to note that whilst he is also a hero, PC Stephen Dennis is definitely a hero, also he has excellent taste in names for said dogs. But he's off duty. And he sees Bolton talking to a woman, she's also walking her dogs, near the entrance to Hubbard Hill's beauty spot in Louth. And he has seen Bolton's image on the Lincolnshire Police Facebook page. So he's instantly concerned for the woman who he's talking to's safety. And he just goes straight over and approaches him. Now bear in mind, this is a man who's just murdered two defenceless individuals. He's got form and history. And this off-duty police officer doesn't think about anything other than the safety of other people. And he goes over to confront him, which I think is incredible. So he actually goes to try to arrest Bolton, and there is a struggle. Punches and kicks are thrown, but PC Dennis actually manages to kick Bolton between the legs, which we can imagine would be deeply painful. And well done, PC Dennis. I hope it was the hardest kick you ever kicked anyone with. I do. I hope that Bolton's balls ended up in his tonsils. I think we all do. I hope they had to surgically remove them from that area. Now, Bolton runs, of course he does, that's what cowards always do when they're confronted by real men. And the officer just goes after him. He's on the phone to his colleagues. And it's at this point that Bolton actually runs back at him because he wants to get the phone off the officer because he doesn't want backup coming. Again, hardly the actions of a suicidal person. I mean, arguably, he's had time to kill himself, and now, in the face of being caught, instead of just giving up the fight and being like, oh, feel really sorry for me, I'm really sad, he's just fighting. He doesn't care. He doesn't want to be taken to justice. And PC Dennis later actually stated, I shouted at a member of the public who was coming towards us. He pulled a knife on the member of the public who backed off. Then he came back at me and he was after my phone to stop me getting help. He lunged at me several times, but I dodged each time as he tried to get me in the torso with one of them. I hit down on his hand, and that is when he got me with the tip of the knife in my upper thigh. So he did actually get stabbed. So even though he's injured, PC Dennis was still able to follow Bolton, and he'd also alerted all the other officers to the direction that he'd fled in. Now, Bolton at this point runs through a river to escape. PC Dennis follows him over the bridge, and at this point is joined by fellow firearm officers. So Bolton really is in trouble now because, you know, PC Dennis has not given up on the chase, and now we have the big guns, literally, the firearm unit. Bolton then attempts to steal a vehicle, and he actually opens the door of a car containing a couple and a young kid. However, the father, what do I always say in circumstances like this? Do not comply. So he's just like waving his arms and letting people know where he is, and this spooks Bolton, and he runs into the woodland. But at this point is spotted by a police drone and the helicopter. So he's being pursued by the firearms officers and police dogs, so we are really now in pursuit. And he's pursued into Hallington House Farm on the outskirts of Louth. Now, at one point, Bolton actually attempted to get into a farm manager, Greta Roberts' car. So she's driving through the property, and she said that she sees this guy with a blue rope around his neck running from the side of the silage store, and she realises that it's likely that this could be the guy who's wanted by the police. And there was just this instinct that kicked in as she locked her vehicle. So she's right. That instinct is correct. He comes towards the car and he tries the door handle, but she's just like able to accelerate away straight. She like burns off as you would do. So at this point, he gets cornered by the police near the barn. When he's cornered, he is like a wild animal. I'm not talking about an animal in a negative sense. A wild animal, when cornered, will act aggressively, but certainly his behaviour is very, very aggressive, and he's cornered and he knows that he needs to either fight or find a way to escape, and he can't escape. So he's got a knife in his hand, he's wearing skateboard knee pads, not because he was going skating, I think probably because he knew that he might be needing to protect himself to some degree. Maybe he was skateboarding, I don't know. I don't think he's the type though. And he's actually encouraging at this point the nearby firearms officers to shoot him. So he's like suggesting that they should kill him, you know, because he hasn't managed to kill himself and now he knows he's going to get caught. He probably knows damn well that he's not going to get shot. But again, I think there is a manipulation within his mindset, and he's trying to create a scene where people feel sorry for him to some degree. Now, ultimately, he's tasered and he's then taken into custody. And it's interesting, when he's placed in the back of the police van, he actually states, "I know I'm an evil person. I'm going to kill myself." Well, you've had a lot of time, mate, and you're still breathing. Is it just me? Is it just me that thinks there has been a period of time where he had plenty of opportunity to do that and he hasn't done that? And he didn't seem that concerned for his life when he was running away and trying to break into other people's cars. Just putting it out there. I digress a little, but nonetheless, you know what I'm saying. Now, PC Dennis later stated, and we love PC Dennis is a hero, he said, "In 20 years of doing my job, he is the most dangerous person I have ever had to deal with. I saw his face as he was coming towards me with a knife. I would class him as evil. I saw the look in his face. He would have killed me without so much as a second thought." And I think he's absolutely right. PC Dennis is absolutely correct. He would have killed him without a second's thought. Now, Bolton gets charged with the murders of Bethany and Darren. Damn straight he does, because he's banged to rights. It's as simple as that. Where else can he go? He's even written down a kind of confession. Also, he's charged with resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer. He's also charged with burglary from the bungalow that he's broken into. And you know how he pleads? Of course, he pleads guilty to all the charges because it's completely obvious and they have a massive trail leading to that. No, he pleads not guilty. What? Yeah, I'm not guilty. You've written down that you're guilty. It wasn't me. It was you. You're wearing the clothes from the bungalow. That's just a coincidence. You're guilty. No, I'm not. Let's see how that plays out. You know that our judges don't like people being not guilty when we all know and they're guilty. So when it gets to court, the trial's at Lincoln Crown Court. You won't be surprised to learn that shortly after the start of the trial, Bolton pleaded guilty to manslaughter. I mean, I'll give him his due when it comes down to being delusional about how this looks. But he's constantly denying that he has murder charges, that he's guilty of murder. As far as he's concerned, the murder charges do not apply to him. None of us know why. But this is why he says it is. He claims that he's basically been suffering from a mental health condition at the time that he kills Bethany and DJ. So what he basically tries to argue legally is a loss of control. Now, a loss of control is a special defence to murder, and it can only be pleaded to a murder charge. So to succeed in a loss of control case, you must have a qualifying trigger. That has to have caused the things that have played out. This could be something that the victim has said, something that the victim has done, something that is really quite sufficiently grave in nature, or you could plead it if you had a fear of serious violence towards you. So I guess that Bolton was trying to claim the former, but obviously this is what he's trying to use to get him a lesser sentence. Now, Bolton also pleaded guilty to assaulting a police officer with intent to resist arrest, and he also pleads guilty to the burglary charge. But when it comes down to the murder charge, he's like, no, it's a loss of control. So Bolton told the court-appointed doctor his version of what happened. He said that, first of all, he broke into Bethany's house. He claimed that he got on his hands and knees and begged her. He threatened to kill himself, and she allegedly laughed and kicked him over. Can anybody else smell the enormous scent of BS? Bear in mind, this woman was so terrified of this man that she was moving to a secret location. This is a woman who had not responded to his texts, to his Facebook messages. She hadn't answered the door to him. And he's trying to suggest that after all that, and kicking the door off its hinges and coming at her, that somehow she's got the wherewithal to become super dominant and make him feel humiliated. I mean, absolute BS. But this is what he says. And he then says, of course, that at this point where he's been humiliated and kicked over, he loses control and he goes into autopilot. Claims that he goes into the kitchen, gets a knife, and this is what he said. I guess I wanted to threaten her. I wanted to Romeo and Juliet her. I probably just wanted to kill myself. I'm sorry, number one, clearly haven't actually read Romeo and Juliet, Bolton, because in Romeo and Juliet, they are in love. They are both in love with each other to a point where they end up dead because they're trying to escape the judgments of her family. You absolute poorly read and making massive assumptions about beautiful love story that goes tragically wrong, and trying to place yourself in that same position because actually you murdered this poor girl. There's no Juliet in this case. There's no equality. She didn't like you at all. She didn't want to be around you. She didn't even answer the door when you were threatening to kill yourself, because at least that would have been one way she could have escaped. Sorry. Going off myself there. Just don't like the comparison with Romeo and Juliet. It's a bad comparison. Anyway, he also said he removed his baby son from the front room. Bear in mind, this is a guy who's meant to have a loss of control. So if you're having a loss of control, firstly, you're saying that you've walked to the kitchen, selected a knife, but then you have removed your baby son from the front room. Well, why? You're having a loss of control. So it doesn't fit, does it? But then he says that's at this point he attacks Bethany, and he tells the doctor this. It was like I wasn't there. Autopilot did the job for me. It's like she went into the knife. Oh my God. It's like she went into the knife. Like I said, this victim mentality that even when he is perpetrating the most diabolical abuse on this innocent young woman, somehow she's responsible. She's responsible for humiliating him, and now she's responsible because she was basically walking onto the knife in his head. Can you see how delusional that position is? But he thinks it's working for him. And then he tells the doctor that he goes upstairs and kills DJ. He said that the first 2 stab wounds were to his temple, and he said the initial few stabs wasn't me. They weren't you. I mean, they were you. But even if you're arguing that the initial few stabs weren't you, the rest were, right? So you're basically acknowledging responsibility in that moment. Anyway, the prosecution, as you would imagine, paint a very, very different picture. They have a completely different version of events. They say that the entire attack had lasted less than 4 minutes. He hadn't entered Bethany's home and lost control after being humiliated. He had remained calm, calculated, and callous during the brutal murders. He'd killed ruthlessly, efficiently. Furthermore, they said that he had an enjoyment of inflicting the violence, and that was demonstrated in the manner of the killings. He used significant blunt force, probably with his fists or some other object. He broke Bethany's nose, he broke DJ's teeth, and that was before stabbing them to death. This was a man who was enjoying that domination. The prosecution argued that he hadn't lost control. He wasn't suffering from any mental condition that impaired his judgment. The killings had been efficient, they'd been premeditated. That he'd planned it, he'd thought it out very clearly, and it's as if this was emphasised even more by the way he acted after the murders. So bear in mind, this is meant to be this chaotic individual, but he manages to break into an empty house, he lies low overnight, he steals clothes to change his appearance. He planned his actions. He was fully in control of them. And as far as the prosecution are concerned, this is why he should be held fully responsible, fully accountable for every single one of his crimes, particularly the brutal slaying of a young family. Former friends of Bolton actually gave evidence at court as well, and they said, look, this guy has got a very fiery temper. He likes to fight. They also referred to his relationship with Bethany as toxic, And although they had never witnessed physical violence, they frequently heard the arguments between them. And the arguments, they said, were often about DJ, this poor little boy. Bolton would be really verbally abusive towards Bethany. He would degrade her. He would belittle her. He shouted names at her, called her names, was abusive and violently aggressive in the way that he spoke to her. It won't surprise you to find out that the jury were just not persuaded by Bolton. They didn't believe he was suffering from a mental illness or a mental health condition at the times of the murders. They didn't accept his loss of control defence. Thank the Lord they did not accept the loss of control defence. Although I imagine that a lot of us feel like we could lose control with this kind of person, this kind of reprehensible, low-life bully. On the 1st of February this year, 2022, they found him guilty of Bethany and DJ's murders. And that trial was so harrowing for the jury members that each one of the jury members was excused from any further jury service for 5 years because it was so harrowing. That nature of the information that was shared during that trial was so terrifying and so traumatizing that they wanted to make sure that nobody could be selected again within a 5-year window. Mr. Justice Pepperell sentenced Bolton the following day, referred to abhorrent physical and psychological abuse that Bolton had subjected Bethany and DJ to, described him as a very dangerous man who took great pleasure in inflicting violence. The judge stated this: Bethany Vincent, DJ Henson and Police Constable Dennis were the direct victims of your offending. Your actions have had, however, the most profound effect on many lives. Your own son will grow up without the love of either parent. His father will be in prison, while he will one day learn that his loving mother and half-brother were cruelly murdered at your hands. He gave Bolton life sentences for the brutal murders. And in setting minimum terms, he stated this, that according to the guidelines, his seriousness of offending was particularly high. And there were many, many aggravating factors in this case of double murder. And one of the big aggravating factors was the element of hostility towards DJ's disability. DJ was 9 years old. He was in his bedroom, somewhere that should have been safe. Also, an aggravating factor was the fact that the killings had followed this campaign of physical, psychological and emotional abuse against Bethany and DJ. This included a breach of the restraining orders. Bolton also had, as I mentioned earlier, previous convictions for violence. The blunt trauma injuries he inflicted on each victim prior to stabbings was a further aggravating factor because it highlighted the enjoyment that creating psychological trauma to his victims gave him. You know, he knew what he was doing. He knew the impact of that aggression and the trauma it was causing them. So that was an aggravating factor. Now, medical experts, when they evaluated Bolton, they concluded that he was indeed a very dangerous man. I mean, it's common sense, isn't it? I mean, what I've highlighted is demonstrated that he's a horrible human being with the most intense tenacity for harm. So we expect that they're going to conclude that he's a dangerous man, but they believe that he's a serious threat to the public. They felt that the killings were premeditated. And finally, another aggravating factor was that he actually left his own baby son with the dead body of his mother. So he put that baby at risk as well. Now, whilst the judge was able to identify a lot of aggravating factors in this crime, turns out that the opposite was true of mitigating factors. So they had a court-appointed psychiatrist who identified Bolton with dissocial personality disorder. Now, that's often referred to sociopathy in its severe form. However, it isn't considered to be a mental illness as such. Rather, it's a mental disorder, which means that basically Bolton had this low threshold for aggression. Now, other characteristics of that condition typically include impulsivity, tendency to act in the moment, no thought of consequences, high negative emotionality, i.e. frequently experiencing intense feelings of anger, sadness, stress, those kind of emotions. Low conscientiousness is another part of this classification, and also this ability to kind of ignore rules, irresponsible, exploitative behaviour, somebody who blames everybody else for their actions. You can see that constantly, have that victim mentality, level of narcissism, lack of guilt and remorse, disregard for other people's feelings, recklessness and deceitfulness, usually a consequence of inconsistent parenting, and by that I mean that a parent will react differently to similar behaviours from a child one day but may punish a particular behaviour the next day. So they'll like be inconsistent, they'll punish you on this day for one behaviour that the next day you do the same and you won't get punishment for that. So it's really confusing for a developing child, and it usually also, on a level, this classification involves an unruly childhood, which is characterised by rule breaking. So in young children, this would be kids who act out, they might have discipline problems at school, they might have truancy issues, they might have substance abuse concerns, and it impacts typical adult activities. So it leads on, because of these disrupted experiences in school and the consequences of that, to problems with employment, problems with relationships, and the negative behaviours will escalate and tragically and typically can end up with violent behaviour towards other people. You know, that list that I've just kind of gone through, well, Bolton ticked virtually every box, didn't he? When I've just covered in this case today, you can kind of hear every single one of those being ticked. Now, whilst those with antisocial personality disorder may lose control and act impulsively in the moment, the judge stressed that this was not the case with Bolton. He said, "I do not, however, accept that you, in fact, lost control at the time of these offences. Indeed, I am sure, upon the evidence, that this was calm, controlled, deliberate and purposeful violence. I acknowledge that your lack of insight into the harm caused by your offending and your lack of remorse are themselves manifestations of your personality disorder." The judge stated that he had given anxious consideration to possibility of imposing a full life term. To be fair, guys, I would have been less anxious and just gone, "You're getting a full life term." Because I genuinely think this kind of a human being is going to be very, very difficult to rehabilitate. I don't think he's going to show real remorse, and that means that no matter how long he's in prison, there is a strong possibility that he will not change. That said, the judge had given anxious consideration to the idea of a full life term and decided that he wasn't convinced on the evidence that Bolton had planned to kill Bethany. So he wasn't convinced that when he was walking that 28 miles to her house, he hadn't actually planned to kill Bethany and DJ. So I don't know whether I agree with that. But we can't be mind readers. And the judge decided that he was probably going to try to get that relationship back on track. And it was only at that last minute that he decided, because she said no, or that she didn't answer the door, and he built in frustration, that he went through with the killing. Because the messages that he was sending to Bethany clearly suggested that he wanted a relationship with her. In fact, it was more apparent in those messages. They had this highly twisted belief that he was the victim. You know, he felt that Bethany was rejecting his love for her. Also, he expressed fears of the idea of losing his son. And so, in spite of the fact that he callously, brutally and reprehensibly murdered these completely innocent human beings who were just trying to start their lives in a safe place again and shortly were about to, he doesn't believe that he actually went there with an intention to kill. So he doesn't put that full life tariff on this case. It's as simple as that. So he decides instead to give a minimum term of 40 years. Also, he imposed a restraining order prohibiting him from ever contacting Bethany's parents or DJ's poor father. Because remember that we're talking about DJ in the context of Bethany, but DJ had a father who doted on him. and he lost a son. Now, despite not imposing the full life term, the judge stated this: in view of the exceptionally serious nature of your offending and the risk that you pose at liberty, it may well be that you are never released from custody. So what he's saying there is, even though there is this term that he's placed on the crime that he has to serve, the parole board may never see fit to release him. So he may die in prison. One can only hope he does. I know it costs us a lot of money, but I'd rather have him rotting away inside than getting out and causing catastrophes for other families. Let's be honest, he's caused enough pain to last a millennia, let alone a lifetime. Now, after the trial, Bethany's sister, Chloe Vincent, stated, Bolton had ruined our family's life forever. And I completely acknowledge that. I completely acknowledge that when a family is dealt such a cruel card, it changes the dynamics and trajectory of that family forever. They are haunted by the losses. And he did that to them. They never got in a relationship with Bolton. And yet here they are, having to deal with the consequences of that representable human. It's just catastrophic to imagine what they've gone through. Following Bethany's and DJ's deaths, Chloe and her parents have all suffered anxiety and panic attacks, unsurprisingly. Her mother, Caroline Vincent, has actually given up work to look after Bethany and Bolton's baby son. And her father, Darren, well, he's had to take on extra work to make that possible. DJ's father, Kieran, he also suffers panic attacks and he's had to give up work. In his victim impact statement, he told the court that he has no joy or purpose in life. I mean, that's just horrific. The idea that he doesn't feel that he has any reason for living anymore because he's had his joy stolen. And he stated this: no sentence in the world will ever be enough for what he has done. I will never again hear him shout, Daddy. The pain and the heartache kills me every day. All I can wish for that poor man is that one day somebody walks into his world and he has a new family that never casts any shadow over the relationship that he had with his son, but that allows him that meaning that he so deserves. Now, as with many sociopathic individuals, let me tell you, you'll be unsurprised that Bolton took no responsibility whatsoever for his actions at all. He just blamed it on his upbringing. He claimed, quote, that he got passed around as a child like Oliver Twist. He's very into bringing up bad comparisons, isn't he? We had Romeo and Juliet, now we've got Oliver Twist, neither of which make any sense whatsoever. Anyway, that's his argument. He was expelled from multiple schools when he was younger. He also claimed that he was bullied. He described his own father as a football hooligan who drank too much. With respect, none of those are reasons to catastrophically destroy a family. But again, the victim mentality is there. It wasn't me, it was just my upbringing. Even though 99.9% of people who have bad upbringings go on to be pro-social human beings who make a difference positively to the world. You know, we have to ask as well, as I come to the summing up of this particular case, could more have been done to save Bethany, to save poor DJ? You know, Bolton was heavily on the radar as far as the police are concerned before he even began his relationship with poor Bethany. He'd been charged with assaulting a previous girlfriend the year before. He'd been prosecuted for battery. He'd assaulted police officers in 2011 and 2016. He'd hit somebody over the head with a vodka bottle. He'd been convicted of armed robbery. He stole a man's phone at knife point. And he was even on the social services radar because they had expressed concerns about the threat that he posed to Bethany and her family. No, they learned that he had made comments about wiping out Bethany's bloodline to the Salvation Army support worker. Also, he told a friend that he hated DJ. I mean, that in itself is terrifying. This is a little boy. He said that he wanted the boy dead. And what was the point of the restraining orders, guys? I mean, these restraining orders were there and he just breached them and got away with it continually. Why were there no consequences? Because there needs to be consequences. And what's really difficult is I talk about this case with the full knowledge that this experience that Bethany had, where an individual could just breach a restraining order constantly, is certainly not an isolated story. It's not an isolated event. Lots and lots of abused partners report similar incidents. And with respect, those individuals have very little faith or trust in the justice system. And in the end, many don't even report the breaches because they don't see there's any point. There aren't any consequences. Now, the Centre for Women's Justice, so this is a lawyer-led charity which focuses on challenging failings and the discrimination against women in the criminal justice system. They say that the criminal justice system is currently failing women. Domestic violence protection orders are only used in 1% of domestic abuse cases. So the offence of coercive and controlling behaviour is only charged in 1.75% of domestic abuse prosecutions. So whilst this legislation exists to protect victims of domestic abuse, it is very rarely properly applied or enforced. In fact, most cases are dealt with by frontline police. They're not actually trained or up to speed with the legislation available to protect abused partners. So many women who approach the police who have a view to obtaining restraining order are actually told to seek civil injunction. So they're told the wrong information. And even when criminal injunctions are granted, their enforcement by authorities are erratic and inconsistent. And also there's been a problem with abused women being prosecuted in cases where all they've done is fight back or kill violent men. Famous example of this is in 1992, the Kiranjit Ahluwalia case, originally convicted of murder after killing her abusive husband. On appeal, actually her conviction was reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. However, it effectively meant that to get that, she had to plead a mental abnormality because there was no defence available to her based solely on the horrific years of abuse that she'd suffered. That in itself makes absolutely no sense. On average, 2 women a week are killed in the UK by a current or former partner. Bear in mind, during lockdown, that doubled. Yeah, doubled. Almost 1 in 3 women, this is shocking, guys. Almost 1 in 3 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. In the year ending March 2019, 1.6 million women in the UK experienced domestic violence. As in this case, children are also often impacted by domestic violence. 20% of children living in the UK have lived with an adult perpetrating domestic violence. Mind-blowing. 62% of children in households where domestic violence is happening are also directly harmed because abusers like to abuse. So if you are a parent and you have children and you're with an abusive partner, it's usually just a matter of time before they become victims too. Now, in addition to what I've just highlighted as far as failing to correctly implement the legislative tools, the other issue is that lessons just aren't being learnt. These tragic cases get repeated again and again, and it's inexcusable. It's unforgivable, because these are lives that do not need to end. A friend of the family described Bethany and DJ this way. She was absolutely devoted to her son DJ and a baby boy. She was only young when she had her first child, but she got on with it. She took to motherhood and was a very good and proud mum. Everyone knows Bethany, and there is a huge outpouring of grief in the community. She was very quiet, kept herself to herself, but she was always coming to visit her gran next door with DJ. He was a lovely little lad, a cheeky, chappy type. Beautiful words about 2 innocent victims who none of us should be thinking or talking about today. Finally, I guess, Bolton will never get the chance to hurt another woman or child. But sadly, we all agree it's come far too late for Bethany or poor DJ. And that's probably the biggest tragedy today, isn't it? That we're talking about the reality of 2 lives snuffed out cruelly and way before their time. It's harrowing when I talk about the statistics regarding domestic abuse. It's important that we hear that for lots of reasons, but the main one being that on every street, this kind of thing is playing out. Behind closed doors, women and men and children are being abused by people who are meant to be there to protect them. And we have to be more diligent and more vigilant. We have to be willing to interfere more, to ask questions, to call emergency services, because often it's easy to ignore and not get involved because we fear the repercussions or the reprisals. But if those repercussions lead to lives being saved, then it's worth offending people. I'm really sad that this has a really bad ending. I'm really glad that Bolton will serve, hopefully, the rest of his life behind bars. And I just, as ever, want to leave this with the legacy of 2 people who were very much loved, very much adored, and very much missed by the family who deserved to spend so many more years with them. This is to DJ and to Bethany. I'll leave it there. See you next time for another True Crime with me. Take care, guys. And like I said, don't be a friend to offend. It's really important to get involved when we see things happening. Call out bad behaviour. Always. It could just make a difference to somebody surviving. Take care.